Hello, everybody. Robin Clough here from DataConsulting. Thanks to all of those of you who attended our session last Friday, which was the 17th of July. Due to a few sort of technical issues, we weren't able to do too much during the session in terms of answering some of your questions that you posed to us. So what we've done is created this separate session to cover off some of the or most of the questions that were asked during the session. Tom and Levi, who were involved in the session itself, are going to take on some of the questions, and also we've invited our colleague Ian to chip in as well with a couple of the other questions. So without further ado, we'll go to the first question, and I think Tom, you're going to take this one.
Cheers, Robin. Yeah, so the first question is, can you use Python quite quickly without being able to code, or is an understanding of coding a must? So first of all, Python is coding, so by definition you will need to understand coding, at least at a basic level. But that doesn't mean that you need a prior understanding or a background in coding to be able to start learning. So a good example of this is I come from a computer science background, so I'd done a fair bit of programming before I jumped into Python, whereas Levi's background is in chemistry. So he'd not done any programming. Python's his first language. He's picked it up really quickly, and he's doing it well at that. So yeah.
All right. So yeah, next one. Levi, you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, I think kind of an extension to the previous question. But the question is, are you aware of any online resources that teach you how to use Python on a basic level? And I think me and Tom sort of both took kind of quite different approaches here. To start with, so Tom used a website called Code Academy, which is a free website which just gives you sort of training resources. You sort of code along with little exercises as you learn. Whereas I did a course on Udemy, so that's paid. I think it cost about £12, and this is kind of, if you're not familiar with Udemy, sort of a series of video modules. So kind of normally about 5 minutes per video, just explaining one topic at a time. And again, you'll have sort of little exercise you can do or not do, whatever you want as you go along. And I sort of found that quite useful, just because I could sort of pick it up and put it down whenever I wanted, as I was learning, and come back to it if there was something I wasn't quite sure about when I was actually working on a Python project. But I think we both sort of agree that the best way for us to learn was actually diving into a real project. So once we sort of learnt the basics, we started a little project trying to pick 5-a-side teams for our sort of office football sessions. So we just sort of wrote this algorithm in Python and played around with it and tweaked it. And I think sort of doing that sort of little side project really cemented kind of all the basic principles and the sort of way of thinking in that sort of Python logic kind of manner.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Levi. Ian, you want to pick this one up?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. It's a good question, actually, about the question is already using dedicated CATS application. But they're going to be moving to learn Power BI and then possibly some SQL a bit later on. So would this approach be encouraged before starting to look at Python? I think the main point to make here is that is really to try and identify the best tool for the job. So the idea of the CATS application, so that's the likes of the Galvanizes ACL and IDEA. There are one or two others, but they are applications which have been explicitly designed for audit analytics, and they have a number of features which are really tailor-made for that particular environment. In particular, things like the log of all actions that were run, and also making the data that's used in those applications essentially read-only, so that it can't be overwritten or altered. And so that's a really important point about the use of a CATS application. And similarly, an application like Power BI, very, very strong in visualization. So using charts and other graphics to display information. It's also very strong in terms of extracting, transforming, and loading data. So those tasks which are going to be best done or can be very effectively done using Power BI. So the main point there is that if those are the tasks that you need to do, then those are probably the applications that you should be thinking about using for those tasks. When you start to look at other applications such as SQL and Python, then you're effectively stepping down a level in terms of detail into coding territory. SQL, obviously, you need to start learning SQL code, and Python, as has already been explained, you also need to start using the Python scripting language as well. It's really going to be when you've identified a need for Python or SQL, it's really going to come down to trying to see, well, okay, what are the best tools for the jobs? If you want to try and do the whole project that you're looking at in Python, then that's going to be quite a challenge. Whereas if you can compartmentalize your task into sort of audit aspects, into visualization aspects, and into other perhaps Python specialist aspects, then that's going to perhaps be the most efficient use of your time and effort and give you the most efficient approach to some of these more complex analytic projects that you might be envisaging.
Great, thanks thanks for that, Ian. And Tom, you okay to pick this one up?
Yeah. So this question asks, can you combine ACL scripting with Python? Or if you embed Python in ACL Analytics, do you need to rewrite all previous scripts in Python? So it's yes to the first half of the question, no to the second half, in short. Python sort of integrates really well with ACL and with some of the tools that we mentioned in the talk. And you can slot the Python scripts just directly, and you don't need to refactor any of the ACL code itself, and it just works really seamlessly. I think that's all.
Super, great, thanks, Tom. Yeah, one for you, Levi. You there, Levi?
So this question's asking how do you know which open source software to use? I think sort of what you really need to do here is just kind of assess the needs of the project that you're trying to do, or the needs of the business that you're in. With sort of open source softwares, whatever you're working in, sort of whether you're working in Python or R or some other sort of programming language, there are a lot of quite well established libraries which have a lot of sort of contributions. They're kind of peer reviewed, varying degrees of popularity, and I think you sort of you have to just find something which you're kind of feel comfortable with using. Maybe that's because you've used it before, or someone you know has used it before, or it just comes sort of well recommended by the community. But I think sort of you also tend to not go too far wrong with whichever tool you pick here. They do tend to sort of integrate, as we mentioned in the webinar, quite seamlessly with each other as well. So you're not sort of stuck if you pick one route and you suddenly think, I can't do exactly what I want with this tool, because there will be another way which doesn't require starting over.
Levi. Tom, I think you're probably best positioned to pick this one up.
Yeah, so the question is asking for an example of what Python can do that can't be achieved with ACL Analytics. So I think those of you that attended the webinar will have seen a really good example of something like this. So the case study that we presented, we used web scraping to enhance our data set, and then we did all the analysis in Python, and then we did some really interesting visualizations using JavaScript. So in that process, the things that you could have done in ACL would have been sort of the data prep and the number crunching, but the more sort of out there things like web scraping and visualization, you might have struggled. So with ACL, the thing that it's designed for is audit analytics, and it's really effective for that kind of thing. But it's more limited compared to Python, simply because of all the libraries that you can bring in.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. And Ian, do you want to take this final one?
Yeah, of course, happy to. This is actually a really important question, so really great that it was asked. I think the short, easy answer is that it's really it's going to be down to the actual users of these tools to make sure that security and privacy are taken care of. These tools they're open source, so from the very beginning, it's entirely at the user's own risk that they use them. So if those tools require access to information outside of your organization, then clearly there's going to be a risk there that you'll need to identify and manage. In some respects, those risks actually are going to be no different to what you probably experience at the moment, because tools like ACL and Power BI can access information that's outside the boundaries of the organization. And they can report information that can be held outside the organization. So you'll have to go through exactly the same risk assessment process that you would do for those tools if you were going to be using some open source software. There's really no difference there. The other point is that obviously because it's open source software, you need to have some confidence that the code itself is not doing anything that you're unaware of. So if you're using a package or a library that's been downloaded from some reputable source that many other experienced Python or other open source programmers use, then that should give you some confidence. Also, the fact that you're able to probably see what the code is, because it's open source, you can actually look at the detail of the code and maybe identify anything that might be sort of happening that you're not sure about. So again, you can examine these things in more detail and make your own assessment of the risks involved. But in particular with open source, it's ultimately going to come down to you needing to actually take some sort of action to consider where have you got that code from, is it from a reputable source, and then applying your organization's own security, privacy rules and regulations to make sure that the data you're processing using that tool is processed in an effective and appropriate way. Okay.
For that, Ian. Well, that concludes the questions. Thanks very much to Tom, Levi, and Ian for giving us their sort of answers to the questions. And yeah, thanks everybody for taking the time to listen to this Q&A session. And yeah, look forward to speaking to you all again in the future.